is good, everybody? Welcome to another episode, and by that I mean the second episode, of Theron Talks Comics, a companion to the Theron Reads Comics Substack and newsletter. This episode is about Amazing Spider-Man again. The podcast is still a work in progress. I have upcoming episodes planned and prepped, but I'm trying to finish up a couple other projects rather than get terribly overwhelmed. A big downside of that is that the first two episodes are both about Spider-Man, and I do not intend this to become known as a Spider-Man podcast. The most important reason is because I have varied interests and plans, but as with issue 26 of Amazing Spider-Man, I found that there are a few significant things worth talking about. Now, with all that bookkeeping out of the way, let's dive into Amazing Spider-Man 31, Legacy number 925. This episode is going to be a little different than the one that covered Amazing Spider-Man 26. I'm going to do my normal review of the issue on the podcast. That's going to be followed by an examination specifically of Felicia's use in the issue, and in a general overview of the series as a whole. And finally, a brief editorial on Marvel's practice of releasing these oversized, extra-priced milestone issues. Needless to say, spoilers for Amazing Spider-Man 31 follow. This is the big wedding issue. Robbie Robertson's son Randy and Tombstone's daughter Janice are finally getting married. The issue opens with Tombstone gathering his various lieutenants together and ordering them to attend the wedding, largely so he can keep an eye on them. Some of his lieutenants object out of a concern that Kingpin is coming back into power, and if they all gather in one place, they're vulnerable. Tombstone isn't having it. From there, the issue moves on to dueling bachelorette parties. Janice is living it up with some fellow villainesses, a lawyer, and Felicia Hardy. Peter and Randy are solo in a restaurant and dive bar in Atlantic City. When Randy wonders why no one else is there, Peter claims that he forgot to call them. Not surprisingly, this plus Peter's desire to go to bed early pisses Randy off, and he storms away. Back at the bachelorette party, Felicia and Janice get into a conversation about how their straight arrow boyfriends, needless to say Felicia does not reveal Peter's identity, deal with their villainy. Janice says that Randy is constantly trying to get her to change and that she'd be concerned if he stopped. Felicia looks on forlornly. In Atlantic City, Randy catches up with Peter and apologizes for his earlier outburst. After calling one of the friends that Peter claimed he forgot to get a hold of, Randy discovered that he had refused to attend. When Randy asks if all his other friends felt the same way, Peter admits that they did, but rather than tell Randy that, Peter took the bullet to keep the rest of them looking good in Randy's eyes. Peter and Felicia connect later that night on his stoop. She proceeds to dump him because he hasn't tried to change her, and she hasn't tried to corrupt him, which suggests to her that neither one of them is very invested in the relationship. Felicia comments that things got dark for Peter, and she lightened him up, but now she wants a real relationship, and he isn't cut out for that. The wedding is the next day, and, as one might expect with a guest list full of gangsters, it does not go well. Things blow up, blood is spilled, and the whole thing ends on an ominous note. The main story takes up roughly half the issue. Following that are a number of vignettes, previews, and prologues. The first sees Peter sitting with the newly resurrected Kamala Khan, filling her in on how she died. This is essentially a recap of Amazing Spider-Man 26, followed by Kamala mentioning twice, in very large letters, that she's part of the X-Men now. It ends with Peter revealing his identity to her. The 5-page Kamala story is followed by vignettes featuring Dr. Octopus, Mary Jane and Paul, Spider-Woman, and a mad scientist. A couple of cute one-off entries follow, one of which involves a goose. Then come 2 more vignettes, one featuring Kraven and one featuring a very bloated and disgusting Mr. Fisk. I will not be reviewing any of the backups, and we'll get to why later. Visually, this is a very fun issue. The art duties are split with John Romita Jr. and Scott Hanna, handling the opening Tombstone scene and the wedding sequence, while Emilio Lezo and Zé Carlos tackle everything in between. A criticism that has been leveled at Romita during this run is that his characters frequently appear expressionless. That is not the case here. Tombstone is menacing in the opening scene, while Hammerhead, the lieutenant who most disagrees with him, is visibly defiant. Romita draws him looking over his shoulder as he departs, and it sets him up as a wild card going into the wedding. During the wedding, Peter is drawn fairly neutral, which does feel off under the circumstances, but Robbie and Randy more than make up for it. Their attitude is almost infectious. Compared to Ramita's style, which tends toward blockier faces and rougher shading, Lezo and Carlos's work is much softer. Characters' faces are rounder, their eyes are more communicative, and the shading is more subtle. This all pays off especially well during the Felicia Peter breakup scene. The choice to split the artists in this way is a good one. Certainly part of that is that there are very significant scene changes, but there are also very different emotional beats being played out. Ramita's art is very suited to Tombstone and his emotions. Over the course of the series, Tombstone might be the best and most consistently drawn character. Meanwhile, the middle section is much lower stakes from any kind of action point of view, but the interactions are more personal. Lezo and Carlos nail these more subtle beats. The issue features a lot of characters, outfits, and settings, so there is a wide range of colors and they line up very well with the emotions behind each scene. The restaurant dive bar, even the exteriors that Randy and Peter find themselves in are almost all brown. Varying shades and shadows, of course, but brown. It's a depressing look, and it reinforces how bleak the interaction between Peter and Randy is. Their matching hoodies are pale yellow. The sequences are practically soul-sucking. This contrasts with Janice's bachelorette party, the much livelier affair, which is awash in a soft purple environment with blue highlights. The women's dresses are each distinct and vivid. The dialogue and body language may give us the nuance of these scenes, but before you get to any of that detail, just seeing the pages on first blush tells you everything you need to know about the emotions involved. Cara Magna gets into that same dueling emotion spirit. Janice's party is full of different sized dialogue and different shaped bubbles to convey emphasis. Shouts and screams are depicted in the same manner as sound effects, separate from the regular dialogue and more emphatic. Peter and Randy's scene has none of that. As for the main story's narrative, it largely works. In fact, if Felicia were excised from the issue completely, it would be Wells' best issue by far. It is somewhat unremarkable, serving largely to transition into a new plotline, but it is effective as a single issue in its own right. A big reason for that is a result of Wells, for the first time in this run, delivering effective character continuity. Randy and Janice's relationship has been on a slow burn for a long time, and it finally pays off. One might take issue with this observation, pointing out that Spencer did most of the heavy lifting to get to this point, and while that is the case, it has no bearing when evaluating Wells' handling of the payoff in this issue, which works very well. Wells takes advantage of the wedding as a vehicle with which to address two significant story threads. As a matter of plot, Wells uses the wedding to revisit the new status quo of the criminal underworld in the wake of Tombstone's defeat of the Rose, thanks to Peter's unwitting assistance. Additionally, he lays the groundwork for a likely future conflict between Tombstone and Kingpin. Wells also advances Peter and Randy's relationship, which has been strained during this run. At first, it seems like Wells is once more setting Peter up as a disappointment for his friend, only to reveal that Peter was willing to look bad in Randy's eyes if it meant maintaining his other friendships. This might be the most Peter Parker action Peter has taken in this run, and it's a breath of fresh air after a year of what can be fairly criticized as cynical and out of character behavior. It's a selfless decision, one that might irreparably damage his friendship with Randy, but it spares Randy's feelings on the eve of his wedding. In the end, it reaffirms the friendship between the two of them. Detractors of this run may dislike these payoffs because they find the existing storylines lacking to begin with. However, this issue must be evaluated for what it is, and these are the storylines that led into it. Thus, the effectiveness of their resolution or continuation needs to be considered in that light. And when looked at that way, there are successes. Wells' smartest decision, though, may be to make no mention of anything that's happened between the Tombstone arc and now. Mary Jane, and therefore Paul, is not at the wedding. Obviously, Norman Osborn isn't either. Aunt May is in attendance, acting as her long-standing Aunt May self. Kamala Khan is no longer a going concern. Felicia is dispensed with quickly and early enough that it doesn't impact the issue's climax. Unfortunately, dispensing of Felicia is where this issue has a serious problem. In a vacuum, divorced from the poor use of the character, the lack of development for the relationship, and the criticisms this series has taken regarding the treatment of women in general, this scene is not a horrible one. Based on their history, there's an argument to be made that they should be trying to change each other because that's what they've done in the past. Unfortunately, that's also the problem. Peter and Felicia have been around this particular block before. Felicia is not ashamed of who she is, and Peter went into this relationship knowing what he was getting into. Additionally, neither he nor we have any reason to suspect that Felicia has been involved in any thievery while they've been together. The most common uncharitable reading of this scene seems to be that Felicia is breaking up with Peter because their relationship isn't toxic. Certainly there is an element of that. But given the two characters' past, it's telling that Wells takes Felicia from Peter isn't trying to change me to Peter isn't invested in the relationship in a single step. The idea that Peter accepts who Felicia is, or even trusts her not to be engaged in criminal behavior, is never even considered. Felicia jumps immediately to the idea that her boyfriend should be trying to change who she is at her core, and if he's not doing that, the relationship isn't worth maintaining. If there were greater context for this conversation, if the relationship had been developed over time, perhaps this would make more sense and deserve a more generous reading. Unfortunately, the relationship has seen no development at all. Since the two started dating, and it's unclear exactly when that was, there have only been two interactions of note. The first took place in issue 20, when Peter attempted to describe how his love for Mary Jane had changed. The conversation never moves on to what his apparent falling out of love with Mary Jane means for his relationship with Felicia. Does this heighten their connection? Does it add an expectation that they want more? Are they just having fun? Joe Kelly, who was guest writing the issue, doesn't elaborate. He chose a lighthearted ending of the two of them planning to go to a hot tub together. The second emotional exchange is in the wake of Kamala's death and is centered around Peter's shock and grief. Felicia attempts to do something to take his mind off the tragedy, only for the two of them to have a small fight over how serious the situation is. This scene, while emotionally charged, has nothing to do with their relationship. Elsewhere, in Mary Jane and Black Cat Dark Web, Felicia and Mary Jane talk about Peter for the entire series, without Felicia ever assigning any kind of emotions to her relationship with him. She simply admits that, in some form or other, a relationship does exist. This brings us to the current issue where Felicia rejects Peter because he is not trying to change her. The next page sees Felicia realize and admit that she got into this relationship principally to make Peter feel better. Things got dark for him, and she was a bit of light. The line suggests that Felicia's presence in the series was little more than as an object to advance Peter's arc. This weakens a character who has a long-standing history of being strong and independent. The admission sets her as unequal to Peter because the point of the relationship wasn't for them to be partners, but for him to feel better. Felicia is reduced to being a thing rather than a person. Wells used her to move Peter's story along, spent no time developing their relationship, and employed superficial justifications to cast her aside for unestablished story benefit. The sequence tarnishes an otherwise very successful issue. It makes no sense in the context of the ongoing story or the characters' history with each other. It is also potentially damaging to one of the characters involved. And not only did it not need to happen this way, there's no reason to believe it had to happen in this issue. Unfortunately, this also isn't surprising. Absent concrete information from or about Wells or editors Lowe and Cebulski, there is no way to assign intent to this and other similar narrative choices. However, there does appear to be a consistent pattern of female characters being underdeveloped, stereotyped, and robbed of their own agency in order to advance Peter's plot. We've seen this with Mary Jane, Kamala Khan, and now Felicia Hardy. And it's certainly not that Wells can't write complex characters when he chooses to. We've seen him delve deep into Tombstone and Norman Osborn. Kamala, Mary Jane, and Felicia haven't received anywhere near the development of those two characters. It is becoming harder to read Amazing Spider-Man without wondering if the apparent disparity in handling male and female characters is a feature rather than a bug. At this point, we've come to the end of my review for Amazing Spider-Man 31, but I want to close out this podcast with a bit of an editorial on this issue's length and price tag, and why I have no interest in reviewing the subsequent supporting material. The legacy numbering puts this issue at number 925. Being a milestone issue, it is an oversized affair that costs $10. The issue features 87 pages of content. Of that, 43 pages, including the recap, are allotted to the main story. Of the remaining 44 pages, 30 of them are either lead-ins to upcoming books and series, Spider-Woman, Spider-Boy, Superior Spider-Man, and Spider-Man Reign, or previews of upcoming story arcs in this series. In a letter to the reader, editor Nick Lowe writes that for these special anniversary issues, they like to provide more Spidey content. All but 12 pages of that extra Spidey content are essentially commercials. This is material akin to what you might find in free comic book day preview issues. In 2 cases, it's actually much weaker. But Marvel is charging their readers extra money for the pleasure of reading it. As for Lowe's special anniversary issues, this is Legacy issue 925, regular issue 31. It is oversized and costs $9.99. 3 months ago, in May, Marvel released Legacy issue 919, but it was regular issue 25. It was oversized and cost $6.99. 10 months earlier, in July of 2022, Marvel published Legacy issue 900, regular issue 6. It was oversized and cost $9.99. 3 months before that, Marvel published issue 1 of Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, Legacy number 895. It was oversized and cost $5.99. Less than a month earlier, Marvel published issue 3, Legacy number 894, which was the last issue of Volume 5. It was oversized and it cost $5.99. In the course of 1 year and 5 months, Marvel has published what they call milestone or anniversary issues 6 times for Amazing Spider-Man, each time using whichever numbering scheme best suited them, with the exception of Volume 5's final issue. In the $10 issues of 900 and 925, the bonus content was mostly filler that advertised upcoming series or stories, or in the case of 900, advertised the New York Library system. There is no reason to review what are essentially previews. They're not complete stories. They don't do any character development. The Dr. Octopus lead-in to Superior Spider-Man is 3 pages long. This is not story. This is absolute filler. Marvel is using the flimsiest justifications possible to get as much money as they can out of readers. And they're not justifying it based on quality or actual story material. Instead, they're merely taking advantage of their dual numbering system and series relaunches. In less than a year's time, we will reach regular issue 50, which is certain to be higher priced as well. And not long after that, we will see Legacy issue 950, also certain to be higher priced, perhaps another $10 issue, or given inflation of the base costs of the issue, even higher. This is the worst kind of cynical sales behavior. It is incredibly disrespectful to the customer. Unfortunately, it will continue for as long as Marvel can convince readers and collectors that these special issues have value. Until the customer base pushes back, they have no reason to change. All right, one review and one rant later, we've come to the end of the latest, and by that I mean second, episode of Theron Talks Comics. I'm hoping to get this off the ground as a regular affair, so please subscribe if that interests you. I also collect my weekly comic reviews into an email newsletter that you can subscribe to as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode, but whether you did or not, I always welcome feedback and interaction here or on social media. You can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky with the handle @TheronsComics. Thanks as always for spending some time with me today. I'll see you next time. Peace out.